Hey everyone, today we're going to be going over some information about the resources that both sides had in the Civil War and analyzing who had the advantage. This is very important for, in the end, who would go on to win the war. So we're going to be looking at the Union and the Confederacy in a couple key areas. So if you look over at my handy dandy little whiteboard here and my terrible drawings, I'll explain what each category is real quick. First up, we have population. So we're going to see which side had the advantage when it comes to population. We're going to look over that. Then money and financing or wealth. Who has the most money going into this war? So who's able to pay for things? There's very important things that they need to pay for the war. Next is manufacturing. We have a little factory there. Who has the benefit or has the advantage when it comes to manufacturing? So things such as making weapons, which would be very, very important whenever it comes to war. Who has the advantage there? Naval power. Who's got the advantage when it comes to fighting at sea? Then our railroads. Railroads are a very, very, very key aspect to this war. Which side has the advantage there? And finally, those are two sabers that are crossed. I know I'm terrible at drawing. And money and weapons. So who can finance the war? So that's a little bit different than wealth. So wealth is the amount of money that's already in those that part of the country versus the amount of money they're raising to pay for the war additionally. So we're going to start first up with population. I didn't mean another handy dandy little thing. Sorry about my lovely handwriting. So we're going to look at the population from these various areas. So if you look here, we have the United States population in millions. So you got the free states and the slave states. So in 1860, there were 19 free states and 15 slave states. Of them, there are 18.1 million free white people in the free states. There's about 0.2 million free blacks living in the free states. It's about 200,000 people. There are no slaves, excuse me, and there are 18.3 million people total living in the northern free states. Then we come on to slave states. 15 slave states, 8 million people in the white population. They also have about 200,000 free blacks and 4 million slaves for a grand total of 12.2 million people. Now, 5 million people there doesn't necessarily seem like it's that big of a deal as far as discrepancies when it comes to the population. There's a couple of big things here to look at. You might be thinking, wait a second, there was only 11 states in the Confederacy. Very true. This is 1860 though. There's no Confederacy yet. So this includes all slave states, including the 4 border states that decided to stay in the Union. So that accounts for 4 more states right there in that 15. So when you subtract their population, this comes back down to about 10.2 million. Now, this is also now that's a much bigger discrepancy there. Now, this gets even lower when you consider that this 4 million people here, they didn't, granted this would be smaller because you would reduce the number of, anyways, from the states that didn't fight. But this 4 million people wouldn't have been fighting, at least not until the very end of the war, because the Confederate States didn't allow their slaves to fight in the war. So the number of actual people that they could pull from the population in order to fight for the Confederacy is significantly lower than this 12.2. Granted, in some of those border states, some of those people did choose to fight for the Union, or not for the Union, for the Union and for the Confederacy, so that 2 million was kind of split when it comes to the war. But you also had a pretty fair number of people living in Confederate states that chose to fight for the Union. So when you actually look at the number of people that each side had, or the amount of population that each side had to pull from in order to form their militaries, the Union ends up with a significantly higher number of people they can pull, and so that gives them a greater advantage in the war. Also, when you look at census data coming up, because you should know, if you don't already know this, you should know that the United States takes a census every 10 years. A census is basically figuring out how many people live in the country. You do it by state and by locality, so you can figure out how many people live in each area and the basic makeup of that population, male, female, in this case black, white, so you can get how many people are living in the country, and you also get immigrants. So with the influx of immigration, for every one it's estimated that for every one immigrant that came into the Confederate states or the Southern states, 8 people went to free states. So you have a significantly faster growing Union population, as much as 40% growth in the decade between 1850 and 1860 in the Union, and about a 25% population growth in the southern states at that same time. So if we come to our handy dandy little chart, as far as population goes, big check for the United States. Move on to wealth. Now we're talking about wealth, we're referring more to just the average wealth of the people living in these places. We're going to talk about the actual ability to pay for the war itself down here when we get to war financing. But up here, when it comes to just general wealth in the area, typically the North has always been credited as being more wealthy in general, a more wealthy region. However, there's been some disagreement as to how that is, and to the average wealth and the way you would compare the standards of living, so to speak, between the North and the South. It looks like it's a possibility, according to some historians, that the wealth in the South has been often underplayed, and that the South was actually far more diverse than initially given credit to. So usually you think of the South as only having the large plantations and everybody else being dirt poor. But some historians and economists have argued that actually the Confederacy was more you could argue that it was closer on par to the Union than people initially gave it credit for. And an argument that was made at the time was that in general, a slave, their living conditions, now not you're a slave, it sucks, and you can be beaten, it sucks, yes, not that part, but that a slave's living conditions, so like their homes, their food, that quality of life other than being a slave, which would be terrible, was not that much different than your average worker in a Union city, because they would go to work, they would work 12 to 14-hour days, they wouldn't really get breaks, they had no medical care, and when they got home they lived in slums, which slums would be the proper word for it, where they had awful living conditions in cramped quarters without enough I guess not cleanliness, they weren't clean. You had multiple families living in one small confined area. Oftentimes there would only be one toilet available for an entire tenement building. So a lot of diseases would be spread rampant. So a lot of Southerners at the time argued that the quality of life in general for a slave in the South wasn't all that worse than if you were a free factory worker, because they would also argue that the Southern slave owners had an incentive to keep their slave healthy. So keeping them, because they weren't really that much use to them if they couldn't work. Whereas in the North, if you got hurt, you got fired, and employers didn't really care how they treated you. And employees, unlike today, didn't really have any kind of rights when it came to their employment. It was, you got paid, you do what you're told. If you're not useful anymore, you're gone. So in that sense, the Confederacy did have the only perk you would say between the Northern factory worker at the time would be that they weren't a slave. So when it comes to wealth, I'd say for this one, if I can find my marker, this one's kind of a wash. You can't really argue one way or the other because there's really just not enough evidence. To manufacturing, this one's easy and this one's fast. So let's look at just straight data. In 1860, according to the census data, everything coming right now is coming from the 1860 census data, all but 5%, only 5% of American iron was produced in the South. You need iron for things like railroads and weapons and things like that. So 95% of all iron is in the border states or the northern states. So that would be a check mark for the North right there. Additionally, every locomotive engine that was built between 1859 and 1860 was either built in the North or a border state. So railways, which we'll get to, boom, that's a northern manufacturing win. Moving on, additionally, there were 239 firearms manufacturers in 1860. 239. 230 of those were in the state of Connecticut, which is a northern state. So this one's very easy. If you're going to fight the war, you need iron. The railways proved to be a very, very important factor in this war. And you obviously can't fight in the war if you don't have guns to do it in. So major, major victory here for that one for the North. Also fast. There were 40 ships in the U.S. Navy at the start of the American Civil War. All 40 of them stayed with the Union, as well as did almost every single one of the naval officers on charge that ran the ships. They stayed with the Union. The South ended up having to get very creative with their Navy, and they really didn't get much kickstart from their Navy until a little bit later on. And also they needed help from other countries, which that wasn't extremely welcoming. So this is part of the reason why the South wasn't able to break the naval blockade, or not break it very well. So if every ship in the U.S. Navy stays with the Union, and as do most of the officers, easy victory there when it comes to Navy for the Union. To the railroads. So at the start of the war, let's go ahead and pull out my handy dandy little, another one of these things, right here. There was 48,000 kilometers, right up right there, of railroad in the entire United States at the start of the war. Of that, the Union, or what would be the United States during the war, had 34,000 kilometers of that railroad, where the Confederacy just had 14,000 kilometers of railroad. So you can already see in the tracks, that's a big advantage. But the question is, does it matter? And yes, it mattered a whole lot, because that ended up being the key way that the Union especially was able to quickly ship in reinforcements militarily into war zones during the war. So in January of 1862, the Union forms the United States Military Railroad, which enabled them to actually kind of commandeer all the railroads and say, even though you're owned by private companies and everything, we're temporarily taking over them in order for the war effort. So it didn't matter which state you were in or what company controlled it. For the purposes of the war effort, the United States took them over. This was different for the Confederacy, because although the Confederacy made the attempt to do this, the Confederacy operated a bit differently than the Union did. That's whenever you want to talk about states' rights when it comes to the Civil War, the bigger thing for states' rights is more so how they operated once the Confederate States seceded. When they seceded, they wanted to be a loosely formed Confederacy, more like how the United States was initially kind of set up to be, where the individual states really focused and controlled their own interest, and there wasn't much, the Confederacy didn't actually have that much power over each individual state. And that became a problem whenever, actually throughout this war, this was a major problem for the Confederacy, but when the Confederacy tried to do the same thing the Union did with the railroads, they got a lot of pushback from the individual states. So that really limited the Confederacy's capability of using their railroads. An example of the importance of these railroads is in 1863, the Union lost the Battle of Chickamauga. Chickamauga is like Georgia-Tennessee border. And this really put Chattanooga, which is a major city, at risk of falling to the Confederacy because the Union had already captured it. So after this battle, the Union immediately got 25,000 troops and sent them down to Montgomery, Alabama, which was really close to Chattanooga, to help kind of reinforce the Union Army there. And they were able to send them from Virginia to northern Alabama in 11 days. And that might seem like a long time to you, but at the time, whenever the railroads aren't that fast, and you have to arrange for 25,000 troops to get together and then ship them, and all the logistics for that, with also within the time frame of you've just lost this battle and then you have to communicate that you need this, that is quite rapid and quite important use of these railroads, and quite impressive. So also, what really also hammers in the importance of these railroads, other than just that one example, is that whenever the troops were fighting, they came across railroads that were beneficial to the other side, they destroyed them. Such as when you look at Sherman's march to the sea, his march through Georgia, they destroyed all the railroad tracks to really hurt the Confederacy. So railroads were a very important aspect of this war, and a very important reason why the North won, because they were able to ship troops, just like that example of 25,000 troops, to Alabama. Also, they were able to ship food and supplies quickly. So easy, not even a question. Check mark for the Union. Finally, we're going to look at war financing. So basically, wars are expensive. Wars take up a massive amount of money, and in fact, the Civil War specifically was extremely expensive. The war is estimated to have cost about 1.5 times the GDP for the United States from 1860. So that's quite a substantial amount of money that this cost. So in general, if you were to look at how money was raised, it's pretty easy to say that the Union easily out-earned and out-financed the Confederacy when it comes to the war, so it cost less per person in the North than it did the South to finance this war. However, note that the Confederacy wasn't that great at keeping records, so take that with a grain of salt. There's actually a chart in your book. Take it with a grain of salt. It's not that accurate. So basically, there were three main ways that the government went about, and also the Confederacy went about raising money for this war, because at the time, Americans weren't really taxed that much. Very, very little. There was no such thing as the income tax. So taxes were actually very little because there wasn't this much of an idea that you really had to fund your government that much. So, and also mostly, the government was mostly funded through the use of tariffs, and during war, trade actually drops a bit, so they needed new ways to find money to pay for this war. So there was three main ways. First off, there was income taxes. Secondly, they sold war bonds, which are basically it's the government owes you money. The government's taking out debt that they owe you. So you buy a bond and the government has to pay you back what you paid for that bond with interest. So you're making money, but the government gets the money right away that they need to fight the war. And this is actually a very common way that we funded wars in the past, specifically World War I and World War II were funded in large part by bonds because it became viewed as patriotic, but we'll get to that in a second. And then finally, began using paper money. Paper money wasn't that big of a thing until after about the Civil War, and we'll get into why that is. Money's just weird. Money is very weird, but we got that also in the next Unit 3. But moving on. So, income tax. North was the first to introduce the income tax. They did this in 1861, but it wasn't really much use until the Revenue Act of 1862, because this set up a Bureau of Internal Revenues. So it kind of sounds like a precursor to the Internal Revenue Service, which would get developed after the 16th Amendment gets passed. So basically, this organization was designed to be able to organize and be able to collect domestic taxes based off of people's incomes. So they ended up hiring 4,000 taxmen to organize how much people owed and collect on this money. Basically, this was controversial because it was viewed as being unconstitutional. So this was only really acceptable because it was a time of war, and it stopped shortly after the war because the needs of fighting the war stopped. So there's no need to collect the income tax anymore. The South also implemented this, but once again, they have the same issue. They tried this in April of 1863 to help fund the war, but they faced the issue of the states again, and the states saying no. So that was a big issue they had, because you would also have issues of, well, who are you paying taxes to? Does the state take the taxes? Does the localities take the taxes? It wasn't really established, so that became a big point of concern in the South. So they weren't as effective because they didn't have a Bureau of Internal Revenue, so they didn't have the type of system that the Union had in place. Also, the North was able to raise more in these taxes, so as much as 8% of the direct taxes came to the Confederacy. Much of Confederacy's money was about 8%. Based on direct taxes. Stop growling. Whereas the Unions, it was 24%. So taxes played a much bigger role for the Union. So that ended up being a success for them, able to fund through the use of taxes. The CSUSA, or CSUSA, that's the name of our school. CSA, the Confederacy, did do a different type of taxing, where they did something called tax in kind on farm goods. So basically, they would tax you based off of what your farm output was. And this would mostly be not so much taking money as taking food and taking the farm products, so they could actually afford to feed the troops. So then they don't have to worry about paying to feed the troops. They've just taken money or taken food in the form of taxes, to help feed the troops. The issues here why this became really controversial for the Confederacy is because when they did send people to go collect this, they were mostly collecting this money from wives and women whose husbands were in uniform out fighting in the war. So there was some controversy with that. And another controversy came with transporting it and storing it. So they would collect all this food, put it in storage, but as you saw, they only have 14,000 kilometers of railroad across the entire Confederacy. They had a problem of how do you get it to the troops? How do you ship this out? So the Confederacy was taking this food, putting it in storage, and it would rot before they could do anything with it. So this ended up being a big failure and also a kind of a PR, public relations failure also for the Confederacy. Both sides would go on to borrow money, which is what the bonds are. So the North actually went to an investment banker named Jay Cook, and he basically set up this whole system of a war bond for the United States. So Jay Cook would went out and basically proposed this and linked it to the idea of patriotism. Buy a bond because it's your patriotic duty. You're going to get your money back. This is just temporary. You're loaning money to the federal government. They will give it back. The reason you're doing this is patriotism. You're doing it for your country. It's a temporary sacrifice which you will be paid back and get interest for, but so help your government win the war by funding it by buying these bonds. So this became huge. People went out and bought these bonds, and it really helped the U.S. get money here. And there was actually the Philadelphia Press, as you read in the book, that said Jay Cook deserves as much credit for winning the war as many of the generals did, because if you don't have money, you can't fund the war. You can't pay for the war, and if you can't pay for the war, you can't win the war. So in that sense, the United States did really well with getting these bonds, and Jay Cook does deserve a lot of credit for that. This would be another area where the Confederacy kind of dropped the ball. They were unsuccessful taking out these debts. The North really, or the Confederacy tried it, but they didn't get as much investment back, because once again, you have the idea of the states' rights thing again of why are we giving you money? Which is one of the big reasons why the Confederacy lost, probably, other than all this stuff right here. Next is paper money. Most money was coins. So the way paper money works, or worked, it doesn't work like this anymore, is the idea here is your money at the time was a substitute for gold or silver, mostly gold. So you could take your the paper money and go to a bank, and you should be able to exchange it to a set rate of gold. So if $1 was worth 0.001 ounce of gold, you should be able to go turn that dollar in and get 0.0001 ounces of gold. Granted, you probably wouldn't get that at the time. They probably tell you need to bring more back, but you know, you get the idea. You can physically, you can't anymore, physically exchange paper money for gold. That's where money got its basis of value from. Why would you take this piece of paper? What's this piece of paper mean? Well, if you have this piece of paper, you can go get gold from it from a bank. Boom, I'll use your paper money. That's where the idea comes from. So the Confederacy is the first to use paper money. They call them graybacks, which fits, their uniforms were gray. So they have these graybacks. The problem is they weren't really backed by anything. They weren't backed by gold. And it was actually really controversial, because with them not really backing anything, and it wasn't required that anybody take them or that the states use them, it became an issue, because additionally, besides the Confederacy as a whole issuing Confederate money, you had states issuing their own money, and sometimes even towns issued their own paper money, and even some banks even issued their own paper money. So which money do you use? So because of that, it becomes controversial, because is the money actually worth anything? Or is it just a piece of paper? And that was where the Confederacy had a huge issue with this. Whereas in the North issued something called greenbacks. So greenbacks and the Union were backed by gold, so they were worth something. And unlike the Confederacy, which had states and banks and localities also issuing their own paper money, the Union had one set of paper money, which made it much more valuable. And one thing that comes with printing up paper money is inflation. With both sides experience this. When you print paper money, it decreases the value of the money. It's kind of like supply and demand. The more you have of something, the less it's worth, the less value it has. That works the same with money. The more money that is printed, the less value the money has, which causes inflation. So basically, prices go up, the value of money isn't going anywhere, or in a sense where you have the prices of goods staying the same, but the value of money dropping. That's inflation. So that really causes a lot of issues if you're trying to buy things because it decreases your spending power, decreases the ability of a person to it decreases your spending power is basically the way to word it. It costs you more to buy things, with nothing really else being changed other than more money's being printed. So with the influx of greenbacks and graybacks, inflation occurred both in the Confederacy and the Union. However, in the Union it was just a little bit of inflation, whereas the Confederacy, it was out of control inflation, and out of control inflation destroys your economy. So right here, when it comes to financing, I think I've made it pretty clear in all three of those areas where they were getting money: income taxes, bonds, and then issuing paper money. We got a pretty clear winner here in this resource. So let's go ahead and take a look at all these resources. The United States, its population easily, meaning they have more people to fund the war effort, or not fund the war effort, more people to fight in the war, and more people to support the war effort back home through working and supporting in various other ways. Easy advantage for the North. Actual wealth between them. I'm going to leave this one as kind of a tie. It probably actually inches more towards the Union, but for the sake of argument, let's just make this one more neutral. Manufacturing, easy, North. Navy, easy, North. Railroads, also easy, North. And once again, financing the war and paying for it also easily goes to the North. So when you look at all of these things right here, the North had every advantage at the start of the war. The North really had the advantage. The longer this war went on, the more likely it was that the Union would win, because they just had more people, more money, and better ability to fight the war. The Confederacy really needed to come out strong and kind of hope to end this, although seemingly a longer war would benefit the Confederacy because the Union would just get sick of fighting with it. But the Confederacy just ran out of the ability to fight the war, which is why they ended up lasting. It lasted 4 years, but they ended up teetering out and not being able to successfully complete the war. And as we've kind of a little bit discussed today, as you can tell from resources, the last thing the South needed was a divided war effort. They needed to come together and unite and have one front where they were just completely dedicated to winning this war, and then worry about the politics of how everything's going to work within their new country. But they didn't do that. So instead, they focused on the bickering and the whole, no, this is our state's right, this is our state's right, instead of actually supporting the Confederacy during the war. And as a result, when you have everything else going against you, you can see why the Confederacy lost this war.